Next we have Ron Turner. Ron teaches theology and ethics at Pittsburgh Seminary. Tutorials of the H. Parker Chair, H. Parker Sharp Chair. He holds an MDiv and PhD from Princeton Seminary. He is the author and editor of 6 books, most recently Transhumanism and Transcendence, Christian Hope in the Age of Technological Enhancement, a terrific book launch. He is a member of the International Society for Science and Religion, serving as Vice President and member of the Executive Committee. And it's been wonderful to come out here for this conference. We've been friends and colleagues for decades.
Thanks very much, Bob. Yeah, thank you. I'm truly indebted to Bob for his generosity. Whatever he happens to say about his belief about kenosis and how it functions in theology, he does surely practice it. We began to talk about 2 weeks ago, and we both showed up as panelists at a conference, and Bob just very generously and spontaneously backed himself out of the program. You saw earlier versions of today's program. He should be talking now, but you have to put up with me. So you might question his intelligence, but not his generosity. But thank you very much, Bob. And Niels, I don't know when I have engaged a paper that has been more productive for me in terms of thinking through some really basic questions that I was already struggling with, trying to make some headway on. But this has propelled me in some new ways. And I'm only hoping that in the time that I have, I can make enough sense of it so that you can see how, for me at least, a number of theological themes fit together and advance together. And these other themes, I think, each have very strong arguments in their favor, but they are often not connected. And so I want to get to that as quickly as I can. First, I want to say, again, what I think Niels is up to in his talk yesterday, as well as his talk just now today. I think he's arguing, of course, for this concept of deep incarnation, which he defines as tying God and the world together, the world of creation, so intensely together that there can be a future also for a material world characterized by frailty and suffering. That's an extremely important motif, as we'll see momentarily. Then he says, deep incarnation moves in the direction of such a comprehensive manner that God, by assuming the particular life story of Jesus, the Jew from Nazareth, also conjoined the material conditions of creaturely existence, all flesh, shared and ennobled the fate of all biological life forms, and this I think is extremely important, experienced the pains of sensitive creatures from the inside. Deep incarnation, continuing with Niels' words, thus suggests that God does not only tolerate, probably should plug this thing in. I'll keep my hands more closely on it, just keep it from blacking out on me. God does not only tolerate material existence, but accepts it and incorporates it in a divine embrace. Incarnation is about a radical divine self-embodiment which reaches into the roots of biological existence, and then skipping a little bit, including then the very fundamental structures of physical existence. From a perspective of deep incarnation, continuing with his words, Christ is creatively present at the bottom of the universe. A phrase which immediately pulled into remembrance the phrase of Richard Feynman. Plenty of room at the bottom, nanotechnology, operating and thinking at that level. And I'm wondering to what extent this is a signal of a bottom-up strategy of incarnation. And we'll think about that a little bit further as we go along. So why does he want to do this? First, he says in 2001, this is the talk again last night, I was, again, Niels' words, I was here particularly concerned about understanding the cross of Christ as God's assumption of the frailty and pain, there's that motif again, of biological creatures, and hence of the motives of divine co-suffering, a theme, again, that we'll want to pay attention to. So one question right off the top is, was this a passing concern in 2001, or is this an enduring concern? I certainly read it as an enduring concern. The second motivation, he says, is more recently, my aim has been to identify and interpret biblical resources from the view of deep incarnation while also exploring its theological ramifications. And that's exactly where I want to take us today. I think there's a third motivation that gets passing reference, and it might be worth exploring just a little bit more, particularly in light of Joshua's very fine contribution a moment ago. And that is, have we drawn too bright a line between the human, non-human distinction? Are we in an age when theology is being propelled to abandon any concept in biology or in cultural evolution, any concept of human uniqueness? Or does that line still stand? Do we still draw it? I think I sense that you're saying the line is disappearing on us whether we want it to or not, and that we're faced with a new challenge. But it'd be interesting to think that one through. But, by the way, my personal sentiments are very much with Joshua, and I think he's quite courageously calling us to recognize that this line is being erased, and that theology does need to take into account that particular challenge. So how does Gregersen go about this? I think in two ways. First, he does this by arguing that the Christian tradition should reclaim a strand of thought that is too often neglected, a strand that emphasizes the physical or fleshly nature of the incarnation. The neglect of the flesh of Christ, he suggests, has been justified or compensated for in theology by what he sees as a misshapen focus on the humanity of Christ. Misshapen because it is, first of all, dualistic, and secondly, because it concentrated in that dualism on the spiritual or the mental. So what's really important is the assumption of the soul, or the assumption of the mind. Both features anthropological dualism and a selective focus on the mental. He greatly rejects, I would say, and seeks to do so by his insistence on the assumption of our incarnation of God in flesh. Secondly, he argues for deep incarnation by insisting that the flesh assumed in Jesus Christ is all flesh, truly and not merely metaphorically all flesh. He writes, the flesh assumed in Jesus Christ is not only that of the man Jesus, but also the entire human race, women and men, as well as non-human creatureliness. All right, so let's try to assess where this seems to be going. So first of all, a few very general comments of a quite specific nature, not terribly profound in their substance, but just interesting thoughts, I think, nonetheless. First of all, I see Niels' program here as perhaps more traditionally rooted in theology than maybe he does. And that will be interesting. I want to push at you, somewhat as Joshua has just done, an account of the tradition, and then ask you rather specifically, well, what's wrong with that tradition? How are you pushing into something new? Now, of course, we live in a radically different world, propelled, of course, by science and technology, among other drivers. But so we can't simply repeat the statements of the past. But to what extent are you, in fact, rooted in that tradition of ecumenical Christianity? I see you as proposing modification, but deep down, you're focusing on incarnation. And what could be more classic Christian? Yes. Right. So that's the first one. In reference to biblical sources, you are quite right that in John's Gospel, the word sarx has a certain multifaceted quality about it, even a negative cast. I would suggest that if you turn to Paul, the classic text of Paul, Romans I'm thinking of, in 1 Corinthians, you would find an even more ambivalent, indeed an even more negative interpretation of sarx, which it seems to me would have to be taken into account if you really want to draw your biblical sources. I think it is also a little odd that there's not much more, there's no substantive engagement, as I've heard it so far, with 1 Corinthians 15 and following. That is the classic text of the cosmic Christology, and it would seem to me that needs to be drawn in a significant way. Another very interesting insight that occurred to me as I was reading along, Niels, in your paper, and you talk about Jesus' Jewish identity, and it just hit me. I think you just referenced the genealogies as proof of that identity. Well, there's a very interesting feature of his genealogies. There are 4 women who are referenced. There is Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and then the unidentified wife of Uriah, who of course is Bathsheba. Uriah was a Hittite, so whether Bathsheba was in fact a Jewish wife or a Hittite wife is not clear. But Jesus is a descendant, if Bathsheba is non-Jewish, of these 4 very prominent, somewhat, Rahab's reputation is pretty explicitly identified. So to what extent is Jesus himself some sort of a hybrid? And if you take into account seriously Mark's telling of the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus himself doesn't seem to like hybridity. She asks for something, he says, basically, your ethnic identity, or we regard you as dogs. And she says, yes, but even the dogs get the food from under the table. And it's like she preaches the gospel to Jesus and changes his mind in a direction of inclusivity, of overcoming these barriers. So what's going on in these texts? Some very interesting questions, I think. And as you were talking today, it hit me that you were talking about differentiation. It seems to me that there's some very deep movements here in the biblical and in the early Christian era. I'm thinking particularly of the priestly account in the Hebrew Scriptures. And it is exactly as you say. It is a differentiation, and God divided the light from the darkness, and on and on and on. Creation is, in other words, differentiation, or as we would say in an evolutionary setting today, it's divergence, speciation, branching out. Originally one thing, now multiple things. That part I heard. The other part, though, I think is not as explicit as it may be, except in the central claim of deep incarnation. What is deep incarnation, if not the ultimate reunification of all things? But if you back up, I see that reunification as a persistent motif that moves through early Christianity, from the biblical texts right on through. In Christ there is no Jew and Gentile, etc. In other words, what God originally separated by calling out is now rejoined. And the rejoining becomes cosmic, truly cosmic in scope, if you read Maximus the Confessor. Differentiation, reunified in the incarnate Christ. Let's move on then specifically to this theme of sarx. I have to say I'm not entirely persuaded that it is helpful to focus on sarx quite the way that I think you have, as something over against or instead of humanity as a broader term. In turning from human to sarx, I think Gregersen wants a broader notion, and I think that's how Joshua just interpreted it, and I take that as being the motivation, so that by becoming incarnate in one part of creation, Christ is incarnate in all of creation. Sarx, or flesh, material existence, being that one level that all creation has in common. So it would almost be a doctrine of incarnation at the base, at the most common level, and therefore incarnation everywhere. Hang on to that phrase, incarnation everywhere, because I'm going to play that back at us a little bit later with incarnation anyhow. Incarnation everywhere. So it's what I'm going to suggest is that Gregersen wants to take us, I think, to the most, really one of the most radically broad interpretations of incarnation that we could have. But the question is incarnation in sarx truly broad enough? Incarnation in information, why not? Or in mental function, and I mean not just human mental function, but the simple functioning processes that occur even in simple single-cell organisms, much more in advanced multi-cell and complicated organisms. So I'm wondering whether this is an appropriate move in terms of the necessity of achieving this broadness. But even more than that, I'm raising a question, I guess, that's rooted in classical theology, particularly the question of the Christology of Apollinaris. In a printed version of the paper, which some of us saw, but not, I don't believe it was referenced last night orally, there's a little bit of discussion about how you want to distinguish your view from that of Apollinaris. Now, for those of you who know, there's a tradition in early church debates, exemplified in particular by Apollinaris, who argued that in the incarnation, what is assumed is physical. It is the sarx. And there is no need for nor place for a human mind, or alternately soul, or any other mental term that you might plug in at that point. There is no place for or need for the assumption of a human mind. The mind of Christ is the mind of the second person of the Trinity, the eternal second person of the Trinity, who assumes and joins in a very strong form of union. And here's where I'm not sure I agree entirely with the way it's expressed in that paper that was circulated for last night, in which I think you were saying that one of the dangers of Apollinaris is that he understands the incarnation as a compound, this is reading from the paper, a compound being consisting of two separate things, a purely divine logos mind and a purely human body. Well, it's true that it's a logos mind and a human body, but one of the virtues of that is you can get them together with much greater unity. And Apollinaris marked one of the high points of the unity of the incarnation. His problem was not the unity of the incarnation. His problem was that it was a deficient view of humanity. And so I would want to press this point back because, I mean, in a way we're not arguing about Christology circa 360, 370, 380. I mean, who cares? Well, some of us do. But the deeper point here is the whole success of your program. Is God truly joined with and one with, and is with the creation? And is that by means of unity with flesh, or unity with every level of creaturely existence, at each level, in a way appropriate to each level? That's really the heart of one of the key points that I want to make there. And I would suggest, as Joshua already has, that a lot could be gained by a really strong engagement with Gregory of Nazianzus, who rejects Apollinarian impoverished view of humanity, or the impoverished view of the humanity of Christ, to be more specifically, but maintains the strong emphasis on union. And this, again, is extremely important. We had an opportunity to converse yesterday, and I recommended the book, which I would recommend now publicly, relatively new, I think September of last year, Christopher Beeley, The Unity of Christ, an astonishingly competent interpretation of these debates. What is meant by incarnation? I mean, let's just focus on the big question. What is meant by incarnation? What relationship does it establish between incarnating God and incarnated creation? Is it merely a relationship, a kind of functional unity, reminiscent of Antiochene Christology? Antioch, the school of Antioch.
Antioch.
Various. Is it like Diodore of Antioch would be the principal exponent of that? According to which, Christ is fully divine. Everybody was Nicene. Christ is, in this case, fully human, but the two are merely in a very close association. There's no real unity, no natural unity. Words like that are explicitly thrown out. Hypostatic unity, of course, has not yet quite become the language of orthodoxy at this point, what was quickly becoming. Well, you jump to hypostatic union, I think, I wasn't quite sure whether you were endorsing that term. Does that carry the weight of the metaphysics of incarnation as you see it? Again, incarnation is absolutely central to your program. I'm asking what goes on when something is incarnated. What is the result? Is there a unity, and is it hypostatic, or is it more, as Gregory himself dares to say? And by the way, this is Gregory the theologian. For Eastern Orthodoxy, there are three theologians. John, the original John, very prominent in your presentation, Gregory, and then Simeon, of course, the new theologian. I mean, so this is not a marginal figure. So for Gregory, he uses language of composite being. When the incarnation occurs, is something new brought into existence, a composite being that does not exist as such apart from incarnation. Gregory uses the term synthetos, from which we get probably a misleading word, synthetic. But if you think of what a chemist does to synthesize, right, you take this and this and you create a new compound, a new substance. Is that proper language in your book for thinking about incarnation? On the basis of, well, so the question would be, the more I think needs to be said about the logic of incarnation, or more precisely the metaphysics of the union. In today's talk, you used the language, you said, as a result of incarnation, God is not just extrinsically, but intrinsically related. So the challenge would be for all of us, not just for our, again, this is a wonderful challenge you put in front of us, and something I think I would want to lift up for many, many of us to work on. I think Gregersen is right about the need to modify tradition. I'm sure I'm doing very badly on time. I don't have a... Oh, geez. Okay. Well, we're going to skip that. We're going to skip that. So I wanted to suggest, in conclusion, that there are 6 themes that advance together. Supralapsarian, which I will have to explain a little bit. Cosmic Christ. Incarnation without human uniqueness. Incarnation without human soul-body dualism. Incarnation without sin in the classic Christian formalization, dependent as it is on historic fall by an ancestral couple. And then an understanding of the nature of God as affective or passionately present in union with the incarnation. I want to suggest that all 6 of those themes advance together, and that I guess I'll have time to say anything about would be the supralapsarian theme. If you don't know that terminology, it's a question of would Christ have become incarnate had Adam and Eve not sinned? And those who take the supralapsarian view say, yes, there's something bigger at stake. God's purposes are bigger than just bringing us back to the original condition of Adam and Eve. God had a far grander purpose in mind at the beginning. Almost every theologian I've referred to here so far, and now we could add Schleiermacher, Barth, and Rahner, are all supralapsarians because they recognize the validity of that point of view. So were the Franciscans of the medieval period, and particularly Duns Scotus, and then if you combine it with the cosmic Christology of Bonaventure, you get some very interesting resources that allow you to do several things at once. One is to expand the notion of incarnation in terms of its breadth, but also understand it as deeply rooted in the original intention of God at the beginning of the creation. So that the working out of creation is at most interrupted by what we human beings do that is sometimes unspeakably evil. No one's denying that there is such a phenomenon of human sin, but if it has gone essentially missing from our theological textbooks as a doctrine of our natural history. These pieces, at least for me, fit together. I know I'm past my minute now. Let me just say a word about the final point, which I flagged, as you recall, at the beginning. Well, let me conclude with this one last sentence, long sentence. So the move away from human dualism, I'm suggesting, from confidence in human innateness, and from a questionable doctrine of human sinfulness, in other words, from a theocentric ground of our incarnation, of Christ's incarnation, is matched by a move toward a renewed theological reappraisal of nature, grounded in new insight into the very nature of God as an affectively relational God. A God who suffers not just in humanity, not just in the humanity of Jesus, not just in the humanity of us all, but indeed in the whole creation. To the extent that we can fill out any one of those theological moves, I want to suggest we strengthen your entire and perfectly wonderful program. So thank you very much.